Hey, how's it going? This is Mike Sorensen here with another encouragements for you people who are leading small groups, just doing community and doing it well. Really thankful for all that you guys are doing. And so just for me in this kind of crazy time, it's hard for us to even all get together or some of you even to meet in person. We're still kind of riding this thing out and a lot of uncertainty and it's really challenging right now. So the whole idea behind this is really just to give you little tidbits of information, encouragement, and leadership, so that you have some ideas of that might spark something in how you're doing community. Whether your group is kind of disbanded and we're just keeping together with praying and interacting over Zoom, or some of you are mixing that up. Some of you are meeting in person. So all those different things, I wanted to just giving you an idea. This is how community works and what God is doing, so that it gives you ideas. I want you guys to take leadership and do the things that God has called you to do. So any way that I can kind of encourage that, spur that on, I want to do it. So today, I want you to think about this idea of inviting people. And, I've talked about it before. Many of you have been around me, have heard me push on that issue of the importance of inviting people. And when you're trying to create that, here's in typical American church, even a church that's starting to do that, the people are out in the community or they're meeting people at work and they're inviting people. Your typical MO for how that would work, a church, somebody goes out and they meet a coworker who's new to town and they feel like they're needing community and they want to do what usually happens, a person says, hey, why don't you come to church with me on Sunday? And that person may come. And then subtly, once they've gotten that person to church on Sunday, or invited them into their small group on a Wednesday night or something like that, they invite them in, and without saying it, without a whole lot going on, there's this kind of handoff that happens to where now I've brought them, I've done my job to invite them, I'll hand it off to the professionals, so to speak, to the staff members, to the church process, because they've got a process for discipling people, for teaching them about Jesus, and I'm going to hand them off to the programs that the church does. And that person then feels like relieved of responsibility for that person. Most people may not think about this if you're not kind of haven't been on the perspective of being on the church staff of how that works. But what that creates is really a bottleneck for discipleship. Because if everyone has to filter through the small number of people that are on staff at a church, or even everyone has to go through the small group leader, what ends up having to happen is that we have to create broader processes to kind of reach those people, to grab those people and get them involved, which means we have to get more and more kind of superficial and programmatic and deal with a lot of people at the same time. What it's lost is that individualized process of getting involved in somebody's life. If it all has to filter through a handful of the leaders, so to speak, then a lot doesn't happen. A lot gets missed because, you've just got a few people who only have so much time, so much resources. So either they spread themselves really thin, or they go really deep with a few, but then there's a lot of people that slip through the cracks. So that makes it a real challenge. That model doesn't work out very well to scale when you take the scale of a church of hundreds of people. So I want to think about that a little differently. So for anybody in the church that comes and invites somebody, if you meet somebody, you have a coworker, you have a neighbor that you get to know, whether they're someone who's not a Christian who's wanting to know about Christ a little bit, or if that's your neighbor that just moved to town and they're Christians and they are looking for a church, and you say, hey, come join ours, whatever. I mean, there's that sense of this person got kind of put in my path and I felt like God led me to them and I invite them. I want to encourage, take responsibility for that person. Don't hand it off. Don't hand it off to a staff person. This one's yours. If God's brought it to you in your sphere of influence, in your activities or your neighborhood, God brought it to you. It's yours. Now, that doesn't mean we won't support you and help you. Your small group leaders or different people won't help you. It is, but we should all have a responsibility for that stuff. I want to look at a guy named Barnabas. Some of you may know his name, but he's kind of sometimes a forgotten character. He's just, he shows up in multiple points in Acts. We know that he did, missionary journeys with Paul, if you read through that. But honestly, he is an interesting character, and really he is a disciple maker. The first thing to notice is that he shows up in this subtle way in Acts 4 after Pentecost, when a lot of that's going on, and there's this big revival within the church. The church in Jerusalem is going really well, and there's all this neat stuff that's happening when people are selling off their land and all supporting each other, and miracles are happening. It's kind of before the persecution breaks out. You see this subtle element of Barnabas comes in and just mentions that he's a Levite. He's of Cyprian birth, means he's from Cyprus. So he's a Jew, but he's also from the island of Cyprus, which is a very Gentile territory. And he had been there probably at Pentecost and was part of that group of people who had experienced this and stayed. And it tells that he sold his land and gave it to the needy. And so he was one of those people that was all in at that time, that said, you know what? I'm staying here. He'd come for the festival. He'd come for that time of Pentecost, witnessed the miracles that were happening, and he went all in and said, I'm selling my land and I'm staying here. I'm going to be part of this early church movement. So he was a highly committed person, but his name was actually Joseph. But the disciples started calling him Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. We hear that and we think encouragement. We think, oh, he must have been this really nice, kind-hearted guy, and perhaps he was. But the encouragement, when it says son of encouragement, that word encouragement is more of a discipleship word. It means literally to call to one side. It meant that he built relationships with people, that he called people in. And that's what he was known for amongst the disciples, that they said, he's a guy who calls people in, who pulls people into his side and disciples them. And so I would love to model it after him. And so it's good as you see his involvement. I want to just show you a couple of things with his involvement with Paul, but to think of Barnabas as somebody, he was not one of the apostles. He was not one of the so-called leaders of the church at that time. He was one of the people, but he's somebody who had that heart, who when he saw an opportunity, he saw someone that needed something, he stepped in and built those relationships. And the bits and pieces we have pieced together from his life throughout Acts, that's what he was doing. He built long-term relationships with people and mentored them. So when we see him in the situation with Saul, we see in chapter 9, after Saul has this epiphany on the road to Damascus, he has this vision of Jesus who speaks to him. He goes to Damascus. This guy Ananias prays over him. These scales are removed from his eyes. And so here is Saul, who's now this new believer who's on fire for God, and he's preaching about it everywhere. And he was a pretty bold person, so he's offending a lot of people. I'm sure newfound faith, a bold guy like him, was probably creating a lot of problems. That's the impression you get. And in chapter 9, he kind of gets chased out of town from Damascus. He tries to go to Jerusalem. And so when Saul, who later became Paul, comes to Jerusalem, it says, chapter 9, verse 26 of Acts, when he came to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was actually a disciple. But Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles and described to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him, and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. And Saul was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking out boldly in the name of the Lord. So he taught for a while. So here's Barnabas was the first one that had the courage in Jerusalem to say, wait a minute, there's something about this guy. I'll go meet with him. All the other disciples were afraid to go talk to him because they're like, we know who this guy is. He's a Pharisee who has been arresting people and getting them killed. We don't want to talk to him. He's trying to trick us, and no one would meet with him. Barnabas was the one with the courage to say, I'll go meet with him, and got to know him. Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles. So he created a bridge to allow Saul to operate in Jerusalem. Give him a chance to teach. Give him a chance to do ministry. Let him do it. He's safe. I've met with him. I've heard his testimony, and I know who he is. We can trust this guy. So he used his credibility with the apostles and stuff to bridge a gap for Saul, to just give him safe haven there in Jerusalem, to begin to grow and be part of the disciples there. So he takes an interest in Saul. But you see him again, a couple chapters later, in chapter 11, this thing happens where you have a breakout of the Spirit in Antioch. So an outlying town, you have this group of people that have scattered from the persecution are there, and there's people from Phoenicia, from Cyprus, and from Antioch that are speaking the word. But then there's some other them that begin speaking to Greeks also. And so you have this eclectic kind of mix of people, including Gentiles, which was confusing to them. And they didn't know what to make of what's happening here because they're not used to including Gentiles in these things. But something was happening. So when this reached the ears of the people of Jerusalem, it says in chapter 11, verse 22, they sent Barnabas off to Antioch. They said, go and tell us what's going on, because they trusted his judgment that much. So he arrived. It says he witnessed the grace of God. He rejoiced, began to encourage them, and with all resolute heart to remain true to the Lord. For he was a good man and full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and considerable numbers were brought to the Lord. And he left for Tarsus to look for Saul. So here's Barnabas again. He gets sent kind of on this trip to say, please go evaluate this situation for us. We don't know what's going on up there in Antioch, but there's a lot of people, following Jesus, and we're not sure what to make of it. So Barnabas goes, first encourages the people there and tries to help them get started on the right path. And then his first thought is, I'm going to go get Saul to come and do this with me. And so he goes and grabs Saul, who'd been preaching, randomly around Jerusalem, and says, come with me and help me build this church. So they spent an entire year with this church, teaching them and helping them and developing them. And he brought Saul along. And it's from there that they get called on their missionary journey later. And so Barnabas and Saul get sent away. And it's on that missionary journey when they first begin to experience the Holy Spirit speaking and moving in Saul that says, okay, now he's Paul. Then they begin calling him Paul when he actually took on his own ministry and he began to see the Spirit work through him in Cyprus. But it's Barnabas that brought him along during that time. And what I just see from Barnabas is he took ownership of Saul. He saw this young guy full of a lot of bluster, it sounds like, and offending a lot of people. But he saw something in him before any of the other disciples did and said, he's mine. I'm gonna make sure we get him safe haven here to be part of this church. But he didn't just hand that off and say, okay, well, Saul's one of them now, and he's off doing his own ministry. Saul was his. And so when he had a new ministry opportunity at this church in Antioch and he says, I'm here, he goes and he says, I want Saul to be with me, and he goes and brings him with him. And when they get called to missionary, he brings Saul with him. And to see that is that's the taking ownership that we're talking about, is when you see someone like that. So for anybody within your group, if the practical nature of this is this, when someone in your group meets somebody and they have a neighbor, they have a friend, they have a coworker, they have someone who's playing football with their kid or whatever, when that happens, don't let that person just invite them to the small group and hand it off. Don't hand it off. If that person's somebody that God put in your path, you take ownership for that person. That's going to feel overwhelming for somebody who's never done ministry, who's never discipled somebody. They may feel like, well, I don't know what to do with them. Yeah, here's your chance to learn. And we're going to come alongside you. We're going to help you know how to meet with that person and what things you guys could do or how you could start that process. And we'll help you with that, whether that's church staff, whether that's your small group leader. Get support, but you take ownership for that person. You call and check on them. You be praying for them. You be meeting with them weekly. You be doing that. Because if all of us are taking ownership for that, like Barnabas did, that's a much bigger movement, and you cut out that bottleneck of everything having to come through some kind of church program. We should be facilitating all those people going out and doing it themselves. And it doesn't have to be at the small group meeting. You could be meeting with them totally separately if that's what works best. So that would be my encouragement. Went on a little more teaching today. I just really encouraged by what I read from Barnabas this morning. So when you look at that, don't hand it off. Don't let your people hand it off either. If you're a small group leader, don't let your people just hand it off to you and say, well, I'm the small group leader, I should disciple this person. No, if God put them in your path, take ownership of them, meet with them, and be a part of their life. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving. And hopefully some things will be getting back to normal in the new year. But in the meantime, God is still working. So let's stay with it. let's keep praying. Let's keep, meeting with people where we can, doing whatever we can in ministry, because God is still alive and He's still at work. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.